Nostromo was a world of perpetual darkness, a planet where sunlight never touched the surface due to its thick pollution clouds and distance from its dim star. The hive cities that dominated this nightmarish world were monuments to human suffering, towering structures of metal and stone where crime and violence were not merely common, they were the foundation upon which society functioned. It was in this environment that Jago Sevatarion was born, a child of the darkness in every sense. The exact date of Sevatarion's birth remains unrecorded in imperial archives, lost to the darkness of Nostromo like so many other lives. What is known is that he was born in the lower levels of Nostromo Quintus, the largest and most brutal of the planet's hive cities. These lower levels were notorious even by Nostraman standards, places where murder was as casual as breathing and theft was necessary for survival. Young Jago learned quickly that on Nostromo, there was no concept of innocence or childhood. From his earliest years, he was forced to develop the instincts and reflexes that would later serve him as one of the Imperium's deadliest warriors. His early life consisted of navigating the treacherous Underhive, avoiding the predations of gangs and murderers, while developing his own capacity for violence. What set Sevatarion apart from the countless other children born into Nostromo's darkness was his latent psychic ability. Even before his recruitment into the 8th Legion, Jago experienced headaches and visions, painful glimpses of possible futures that plagued his young mind. These abilities manifested unpredictably, sometimes providing him with the foresight to avoid danger, other times crippling him with pain at inopportune moments. Without proper training or understanding, Sevatarion viewed these episodes as both a curse and an occasional advantage in the brutal environment of Nostromo. Survival on Nostromo required more than just physical strength or cunning. It demanded a certain moral flexibility that became ingrained in Sevatarion's character. He learned that justice was a meaningless concept in a world where the strong preyed upon the weak without consequence. This understanding shaped his worldview long before he encountered the Night Haunter or Herd of the Emperor's grand vision for humanity. By the time he reached adolescence, Jago had become something of a predator himself, not out of any inherent cruelty, but out of necessity. He had developed a reputation in his corner of the Underhive, not as a gang leader or notorious killer, but as someone who survived when others did not. Someone who understood the darkness of Nostromo better than most. The arrival of Konrad Curze changed everything on Nostromo. The Primarch's brutal campaign of terror against the criminal elements of Nostromo Quintus created a new order, one built on fear rather than justice. For the first time in the planet's history, crime was punished consistently and mercilessly. The Night Haunter, as Curze came to be known, stalked the streets and slaughtered wrongdoers with a savagery that shocked even the hardened citizens of Nostromo. When the Emperor discovered Curze in the 30th millennium, the Primarch had already transformed Nostromo into a compliant world through his campaign of terror. The Night Lord's Legion, originally known as the 8th Legion, was given to Curze to command. Unlike many other legions, the Night Lords did not immediately receive recruits from their Primarch's homeworld. It was only after Curze had established his rule and the Emperor had departed that the 8th Legion began to induct Nostraman recruits. Jago Sevatarion was among the first generation of Nostramans to be selected for the Night Lords. The recruitment process on Nostromo differed significantly from that of other Legion homeworlds. There were no formal trials or competitions. Instead, the Legion's apothecaries and recruiters sought out those who had survived the planet's brutality while displaying particular aptitudes for violence and cunning. Sevatarion caught the attention of the Legion's recruiters not just for his physical capabilities, but for his psychological profile. The Night Lords valued a particular kind of recruit, those who understood fear as a weapon and who could function in the moral darkness that defined their Legion's approach to warfare. Jago, shaped by Nostromo's perpetual night, fit this profile perfectly. The transformation from human to Astartes was as brutal as everything else on Nostromo. The implantation of gene seed, the surgical modifications, and the hypno-indoctrination were all conducted with clinical efficiency rather than ceremony. For Sevatarion, the process was particularly difficult due to his undiagnosed psychic abilities, which caused complications during certain stages of the transformation. These complications were noted by the Legion's apothecaries, but not fully understood at the time. When Sevatarion emerged from his transformation, he was no longer merely a survivor of Nostromo's darkness. He had become a weapon forged in it. His natural talents had been enhanced by the gene seed of the 8th Legion, creating a warrior of remarkable skill and potential. Yet, unlike many of his fellow legionaries who embraced the Night Lord's identity with zealous fervor, Sevatarion maintained a certain detachment, a trait that would later define his relationship with both his legion and its Primarch. Konrad Curze took particular notice of Sevatarion during the early training of the Nostraman recruits. The Primarch, with his own burden of prophetic visions and mental instability, perhaps recognized something of himself in the young Astartes. Their first meeting was not recorded for posterity, but what is known is that Curze quickly elevated Sevatarion to positions of increasing responsibility within the Legion. The relationship between Sevatarion and Curze was complex from the beginning. There was respect, certainly. Sevatarion recognized the Primarch's power and vision, while Curze valued Sevatarion's pragmatism and combat abilities. Yet there was also a tension that stemmed from their fundamental differences. Curze was driven by his apocalyptic visions and a twisted sense of justice, while Sevatarion maintained a more pragmatic view of their legion's purpose. This dynamic was evident in one of their earliest recorded interactions, when Curze explained his philosophy of using terror as a weapon. While many Night Lords embraced this approach with sadistic enthusiasm, Sevatarion's response was characteristically measured. He understood the tactical value of fear, but did not share Curze's conviction that their methods were ultimately just or necessary for a greater purpose. This philosophical difference did not diminish Curze's trust in Sevatarion's abilities, but it did establish a pattern of respectful disagreement that would characterize their relationship throughout the Great Crusade. As the Great Crusade expanded across the galaxy in the late 30th millennium, the Night Lords carved out a reputation as specialists in psychological warfare and terror tactics. The 8th Legion was deployed to worlds where conventional compliance had failed, where populations needed to be broken through fear rather than conquered through force alone. In these campaigns, Sevatarion distinguished himself not just through his combat prowess, but through his tactical acumen. Sevatarion's combat style developed into something distinctive even among the Night Lords. He combined the brutal efficiency expected of an Astartes with an almost prescient awareness of the battlefield, a benefit of his latent psychic abilities, though this connection was not yet fully understood. He favored lightning-fast strikes and psychological warfare, often targeting enemy leadership or symbolic objectives to maximize the impact of Night Lords' operations. His weapon of choice became the chainglaive, a Night Lord's adaptation of the traditional power glaive that incorporated a chainblade element. In Sevatarion's hands, this unwieldy weapon became an instrument of precision terror, capable of decapitating an enemy commander one moment and clearing a swath through infantry the next. His mastery of this difficult weapon further distinguished him among his battle brothers. During a particularly challenging compliance action on the fortress world of Kalroth, Sevatarion's tactical innovations saved a Night Lord's operation that had become bogged down in urban warfare. Rather than continuing the costly direct assault that had been ordered, he led a small team of elite warriors through the city's water reclamation system, emerging behind enemy lines to eliminate the planetary governor and his command staff. The planet's resistance collapsed within hours, with minimal Legion casualties. This operation caught Curze's attention and led to Sevatarion's promotion to company command. As Sevatarion rose through the ranks of the Night Lords, his reputation grew both within the Legion and beyond it. To his battle brothers, he was known for his deadpan humor and pragmatic approach to warfare. To the other legions who occasionally fought alongside the Night Lords, he was seen as one of the few rational voices within a legion increasingly known for its excesses and brutality. The pivotal moment in Sevatarion's rise came during the compliance of Daromer, where the Night Lords faced a coalition of Xenos-influenced human states. During this campaign, the legion's existing first captain was killed in an ambush, leaving a critical leadership vacuum. Curze, who had been observing Sevatarion's performance with increasing interest, elevated him directly to the position of first captain, bypassing several more senior officers in the process. This promotion was not without controversy within the Legion. Several veteran captains had expected to be considered for the position, and Sevatarion's relatively rapid rise generated resentment. However, Curze's decision proved prescient. As first captain, Sevatarion brought a new level of discipline and tactical sophistication to the Night Lord's operations, tempering their terror tactics with strategic purpose. It was also during this period that Sevatarion received his nickname, the Prince of Crows. The exact origin of this title is disputed in imperial records. Some accounts claim it was bestowed by Curze himself, recognizing Sevatarion's ability to strike from the shadows. Others suggest it originated among the rank-and-file legionaries, who noted his tendency to appear unexpectedly on the battlefield, like the carrion birds of ancient Terra descending on the dead. Whatever its origin, the title stuck, becoming as much a part of his identity as his formal rank. As first captain, Sevatarion also took command of the Atrementor, the elite Terminator squad that served as the Legion's premier assault force. Under his leadership, the Atrementor developed into one of the most feared units in the Great Crusade, combining the implacable advance of Terminator armor with the psychological warfare tactics that define the Night Lords. Jago Sevatarion's elevation to first captain of the Night Lords Legion marked a significant shift in the Legion's command structure. While many first captains across the Legion's Astartes were appointed due to their martial prowess alone, Curze's selection of Sevatarion stemmed from a more complex calculus. The Night Haunter recognized in his first captain not just a superlative warrior, but a mind that understood the nuances of terror as a tactical weapon without becoming lost in its implementation. The formal ceremony of Sevatarion's appointment was characteristic of the Night Lords, brief, lacking ostentation, and tinged with an undercurrent of threat. In the stratagem of the Legion flagship Nightfall, before the assembled company captains, Curze simply announced his decision. The new first captain received the traditional symbols of his office, the ornate skull-faced helm that would become his signature and command of the Atrementor. No speeches were made, no oaths sworn beyond those already binding every Night Lord to their Primarch. The message was clear: Sevatarion would be judged by his actions, not his words. As first captain, Sevatarion's responsibilities expanded considerably. He became not just a warrior, but the primary executor of Curze will across the Legion. This included oversight of the Legion's tactical deployments, coordination between company captains, and management of the specialized units that gave the Night Lords their fearsome reputation. Perhaps most importantly, he served as the filter through which Curze's often erratic commands were interpreted and implemented. The position of equerry came to Sevatarion not through formal appointment, but through practical necessity. As Curze's mental state deteriorated during the later years of the Great Crusade, he increasingly withdrew from the day-to-day command of his legion. Into this vacuum stepped Sevatarion, who found himself not just carrying out the Primarch's orders, but often determining what those orders should be. He became the voice of the Night Haunter when the Primarch retreated into his prophetic visions, and the restraining hand when Curze's darker impulses threatened to undermine the Legion's strategic objectives. This arrangement was never officially acknowledged. Curze would not have tolerated any suggestion that he needed a caretaker, but it was understood by the Legion's senior officers. When Sevatarion spoke, they listened, knowing that he had the closest thing to the Primarch's ear that anyone could claim. This influence extended beyond military matters. Sevatarion became one of the few individuals who could approach Curze during his episodes of withdrawal or rage without risking immediate execution. The tactical contributions Sevatarion made to the Night Lords during the Great Crusade were substantial and distinctive. While Curze established the Legion's overarching philosophy of compliance through fear, it was Sevatarion who developed many of the specific methodologies that made this approach effective rather than merely brutal. One of his most significant innovations was the decapitation protocol, first implemented during the compliance of Piemen. Rather than following the conventional Astartes approach of overwhelming force applied to military targets, Sevatarion directed Night Lord strike teams to simultaneously eliminate every level of planetary leadership, from the highest governor to local administrators, in a single night of coordinated terror. By morning, the population found themselves not just defeated but utterly leaderless, with Night Lords officers stepping into the governance vacuum with prepared compliance demands. This approach minimized civilian casualties while maximizing psychological impact, achieving compliance with unprecedented speed. Sevatarion also refined the Night Lords' approach to urban warfare, developing tactics that exploited their superior night fighting capabilities. The Shadow Corridor technique became a signature of Night Lord's operations under his command, a method of creating artificial darkness through targeted destruction of lighting and power infrastructure, followed by rapid strikes against enemies unable to adapt to the sudden blindness. This approach proved particularly effective against technologically advanced societies that had grown dependent on artificial illumination. Perhaps most controversially, Sevatarion pioneered what came to be known as exemplary deterrence, the practice of identifying and punishing specific segments of a population to ensure the compliance of the whole. Unlike some Night Lords officers who advocated indiscriminate terror, Sevatarion's approach was coldly mathematical. He developed analytical frameworks to identify which groups within a society held the most influence over others, then directed precisely calibrated atrocities against those groups to maximize the deterrent effect on the broader population. This methodical approach to terror set Sevatarion apart from many of his fellow officers. While others in the Legion increasingly indulged in cruelty for its own sake, the first captain maintained that fear was a means to an end, the swift compliance of worlds with minimal Legion casualties. This pragmatism sometimes put him at odds with battle brothers who had embraced the darker aspects of their Primarch's philosophy, but none could argue with the results his methods achieved. The pacification of Daromer demonstrated Sevatarion's tactical approach at its most refined. The campaign began with conventional Night Lords' terror tactics, but when the population retreated into vast underground shelter complexes, many Legion officers advocated for mass destruction of these refuges. Sevatarion instead deployed infiltration teams to capture the environmental control systems of these shelters. Rather than killing the civilians directly, he ordered periodic shutdowns of life support, brief enough to avoid mass casualties, but long enough to demonstrate the population's complete vulnerability. After 3 such episodes, the planetary leadership emerged to surrender, having never fired a shot in resistance. Sevatarion's implementation of psychological warfare extended beyond the battlefield. He established dedicated intelligence cadres within the Legion, tasked with gathering cultural and sociological data on target populations. This information allowed the Night Lords to tailor their terror tactics to exploit specific cultural fears and taboos, maximizing psychological impact while minimizing the actual force required. On Sheol Tertius, these methods reached their apotheosis. Intelligence indicated that the planet's dominant culture held a superstitious dread of dismemberment, believing it prevented proper passage to the afterlife. Rather than engaging the planet's substantial military forces directly, Sevatarion ordered the capture and precise dismemberment of a single company of their elite guards. The remains were arranged in a pattern visible from the planet's capital city. Within hours, the planetary government opened communication channels to discuss terms of surrender. Such operations earned the Night Lords a fearsome reputation, but also drew criticism from other legions. Robute Gilliman of the Ultramarines notably condemned the Night Lords' methods as counterproductive to the creation of a stable Imperium, while Sanguinius of the Blood Angels questioned whether worlds brought to compliance through such methods could ever be truly loyal. Sevatarion dismissed such concerns with his characteristic dry wit, reportedly telling an Ultramarine delegation that fear lasts longer than love and costs significantly less to maintain. Within the Night Lord's command structure, Sevatarion's position was complex. As first captain, he held formal authority second only to Curze himself, but the Legion's culture of competition and predatory hierarchy meant this authority required constant reinforcement. Several senior officers viewed Sevatarion's rapid rise with suspicion or outright resentment, particularly those who had served in the 8th Legion before the discovery of Curze. Zo Sahal, who would later claim the title Talonmaster, maintained a particularly complicated relationship with Sevatarion. As commander of the Night Lord's Raptor units, Sahal controlled some of the Legion's most effective terror troops, giving him substantial influence. While never openly challenging Sevatarion's authority, Sahal cultivated a separate power base within the Legion, positioning himself as a more faithful interpreter of Curze's philosophy. The tension between the two officers never erupted into open conflict, but manifested in subtle competition for resources and the Primarch's favor. Krieg Acerbus, known as the Aximaster, presented a different kind of challenge. Where Sahal was calculating, Acerbus was direct, a blunt instrument of destruction who viewed Sevatarion's tactical subtlety as unnecessary complication. As commander of the Legion's assault companies, Acerbus advocated for more straightforward applications of violence. Sevatarion tolerated this perspective when circumstances warranted overwhelming force, but frequently overruled Acerbus when more precise approaches were required. This created a professional friction that occasionally spilled over into personal animosity. The officer known simply as Shang represented yet another faction within the Legion. As the master of the Night Lord's Librarius, Shang was one of the few who recognized Sevatarion's latent psychic abilities for what they were. He repeatedly urged the first captain to undergo proper psychic training, warnings that Sevatarion consistently ignored. This created an unusual dynamic where Shang simultaneously respected Sevatarion's authority while believing him dangerously ignorant of his own nature. Their interactions were characterized by a wary professional respect that never developed into true camaraderie. Despite these internal tensions, Sevatarion maintained effective command through a combination of demonstrated competence, Curze's backing, and his own formidable combat abilities. When challenges to his authority did arise, he typically resolved them through direct action rather than political maneuvering. In one notable instance, when a company captain named Malcharian questioned his orders during the assault on Callisto Primus, Sevatarion challenged him to a duel in the Nightfall's fighting pits. The contest ended not with death, but with Malcharian's grudging submission, a demonstration of both Sevatarion's skill and his pragmatic understanding that the Legion could not afford to lose effective officers to internal power struggles. This pragmatism extended to Sevatarion's management of the Legion's increasingly problematic recruitment practices. As the Great Crusade progressed, the quality of recruits from Nostromo steadily declined. The Night Haunter's reign of terror had initially created a more orderly society, but in his absence, the planet had reverted to corruption and criminality. Rather than the disciplined survivors of a harsh but ordered world, the Legion now received sadists and murderers who embraced cruelty for its own sake. Sevatarion recognized the threat this posed to the Legion's effectiveness. While never openly criticizing his homeworld, he implemented stricter screening protocols for Nostraman recruits and advocated for drawing aspirants from other worlds when possible. This put him at odds with officers who viewed Nostraman heritage as integral to the Legion's identity, but Sevatarion maintained that their purpose was compliance, not cultural preservation. Throughout these internal challenges, Sevatarion's position as Curze's equerry gave him unique insight into the Primarch's deteriorating mental state. He witnessed firsthand the increasing frequency of Curze's prophetic seizures and his growing obsession with visions of his own death. While other officers might see the Night Haunter only in his moments of terrible clarity, Sevatarion also saw the aftermath, the periods of withdrawal and self-loathing that followed Curze's worst excesses. This perspective shaped Sevatarion's approach to his role. He came to see himself not just as the executor of Curze's will, but as the protector of the Legion from the worst consequences of their Primarch's instability. When Curze ordered excessive brutality that might provoke unnecessary imperial censure, Sevatarion found ways to moderate the implementation while maintaining the appearance of full compliance. When the Primarch retreated into his quarters for weeks at a time, it was Sevatarion who ensured the Legion continued to function in his absence. Few officers within the Legion's Astartes cultivated as distinctive a personal presence as Jago Sevatarion. While many Night Lords embraced their Legion's fearsome reputation with theatrical displays of cruelty, Sevatar's approach was markedly different. His sardonic humor and detached demeanor created a persona that was, in many ways, more unsettling than the overt sadism of his battle brothers. Sevatar's wit manifested as a dry, cutting sarcasm that spared no one, not his subordinates, not his fellow officers, not even his Primarch. Where other Legion officers might have been executed for such insolence, Sevatar's irreverence was tolerated, even valued by Curze. In the grim darkness of the Night Lords, Sevatar's gallows humor served as both a pressure valve and a reminder that they had not completely surrendered their humanity to the darkness they wielded as a weapon. This humor was most evident in Sevatar's interactions with representatives from other legions. During a joint operation with the word-bearers on Halst 4, when Chaplain Erebus delivered a lengthy oration on the divine purpose of compliance, Sevatar reportedly responded by checking his chronometer and asking if the sermon counted toward the campaign's timetable. Such remarks earned him few friends outside his legion, but cemented his reputation as unpredictable and impossible to intimidate. Even in combat, Sevatar maintained this sardonic detachment. Unlike many Astartes who roared battle cries or vox-amplified threats, the first captain often fought in complete silence, speaking only to issue commands or deliver precisely timed taunts designed to unbalance opponents. Survivors of encounters with the Prince of Crows frequently reported that his calm, almost conversational tone during combat was more terrifying than the screams and threats of other Night Lords. This aspect of Sevatar's persona was not merely affectation, but a deliberate psychological tool. By maintaining his composure and humor in situations where others succumbed to rage or bloodlust, he created an impression of control and inevitability that enhanced the Night Lord's terror tactics. An enemy facing a screaming berserker might hope to outlast their fury. One facing Sevatar's calm efficiency had no such hope. Behind this sardonic exterior lay a complex ethical framework that distinguished Sevatar from many of his fellow Night Lords. While the Legion increasingly attracted recruits who reveled in cruelty for its own sake, Sevatar maintained a personal code that, while brutal by Imperial standards, contained its own internal logic and boundaries. Central to this code was Sevatar's conception of justice, a concept he approached differently than his Primarch. Where Curze saw justice as punishment proportional to crime, Sevatar viewed it more pragmatically as the maintenance of order through necessary violence. This distinction might seem academic, but it fundamentally shaped his approach to Legion operations. For Curze, the suffering of the guilty was an end in itself. For Sevatar, it was merely a means to an end. This pragmatism manifested in Sevatar's targeting decisions during compliance actions. While some Night Lords' officers directed atrocities against civilian populations indiscriminately, Sevatar's operations displayed a cold efficiency in their selection of victims. He preferred to target those whose deaths would have the greatest deterrent effect: political leaders, wealthy elites, military officers. This approach minimized unnecessary casualties while maximizing psychological impact, not out of mercy, but out of tactical calculation. Sevatar's personal code also included a stark honesty that was rare among the increasingly duplicitous Night Lords. He neither denied the nature of his actions nor attempted to justify them through elaborate rationalizations. When questioned by a captured Imperial Army officer about the Night Lord's methods during the compliance of Daromer, Sevatar reportedly responded, "We are what circumstances have made us. I offer neither apology nor excuse." This blunt acknowledgement of his nature extended to his interactions with his own legion, where he was known for delivering unvarnished assessments regardless of how they might be received. Perhaps most surprisingly for an officer of the 8th Legion, Sevatar maintained a certain standard of honor in personal combat. Not honor as the more chivalric legions might define it, but his own consistent code. He did not torture defeated opponents unnecessarily, preferring clean kills when death was required. He kept his word when given, a trait that made his rare promises significant within a legion increasingly known for treachery. And unlike many Night Lords who preferred to attack from ambush, Sevatar often faced worthy opponents directly, testing his skills against theirs in what passed for fair combat in the 8th Legion. This personal code created tensions within the Legion as it drifted further from its original purpose. Sevatar frequently clashed with officers who embraced cruelty as an end rather than a means, particularly those recruited in the later years of the Great Crusade. He viewed their sadism as not just unnecessary but counterproductive, a distraction from the Legion's mission of rapid compliance through targeted fear. One notable confrontation occurred following the compliance of Vhnori, where a recently promoted captain named Curze had ordered the flaying of civilian administrators after they had already surrendered. Sevatar did not reprimand Curze publicly. Such a display would have undermined Legion discipline, but summoned him to a private meeting in the Nightfall Strategium. What transpired was not recorded, but witnesses reported that Curze emerged visibly shaken, with fresh scars visible at his collar. The captain's subsequent operations showed notably more restraint in their application of terror tactics. Underlying Sevatar's distinctive persona and ethical code was a secret that only a handful within the Legion suspected: his latent psychic abilities. These abilities manifested primarily as combat precognition, brief, painful glimpses of immediate futures that gave him a fraction of a second's advantage in battle. Unlike the controlled foresight of trained psychers, Sevatar's abilities came in unpredictable flashes, often accompanied by debilitating headaches. These episodes began long before his recruitment into the Legion, during his childhood on Nostromo. Without understanding or context, young Jago experienced them as a mysterious affliction, moments when reality seemed to split and show him things that had not yet happened. The pain that accompanied these visions led him to develop techniques to suppress them, mental exercises that became habitual long before he understood what he was suppressing. By the time the Emperor's ban on psychic powers was formalized at the Council of Nicaea, Sevatar had been actively denying his abilities for decades. Unlike many psychers who struggled with the edict, Sevatar had no formal training to abandon, no psychic discipline to forsake. His methods of suppression were entirely self-taught, developed through painful trial and error in Nostromo's underhive and refined during his years as an Astartes. These suppression techniques were not completely effective. Under extreme stress or in life-threatening situations, Sevatar's precognitive abilities would sometimes break through his mental barriers. These breakthrough episodes became part of his fearsome reputation, moments when he seemed to anticipate attacks that should have been impossible to predict, or when he reacted to threats before they fully materialized. The most dramatic of these incidents occurred during an assassination attempt by a word-bearer's operative during the joint operation on Halst 4. The assassin, using a phase blade that should have been undetectable, struck at Sevatar during a strategy conference. Without any visible warning, the first captain moved precisely 4 centimeters to his left, just enough for the blade to miss his primary heart. In the same motion, he seized the assassin's arm and broke it at the elbow. Witnesses reported that Sevatar showed no surprise, only irritation, as though the attempt was an expected annoyance rather than a near-death experience. Such incidents did not go unnoticed. Shang, the Night Lord's chief librarian before Nicaea, recognized the signs of untrained psychic ability in Sevatar's combat performance. He approached the first captain multiple times, offering training and guidance in controlling these abilities. Sevatar consistently refused, dismissing Shang's concerns with his characteristic sarcasm and changing the subject to Legion operations. This refusal stemmed not from adherence to Legion policy. The Night Lords were notably lax in their enforcement of anti-psyker edicts, but from Sevatar's personal aversion to acknowledging this aspect of himself. For a warrior who prided himself on control and clarity, these unpredictable episodes represented a vulnerability he was unwilling to explore. The headaches and disorientation that accompanied his precognitive flashes were a price he accepted in exchange for not confronting their implications. Sevatar's denial became more complicated after Nicaea, when the Emperor's edict officially banned the use of psychic powers within the legions. Though he had never formally trained as a psyker, Sevatar was technically in violation of imperial decree every time his abilities manifested in combat. This created another layer of secrecy around his condition, not just personal denial, but necessary concealment. The psychological toll of this suppression manifested in Sevatar's periodic migraines, episodes so severe they occasionally incapacitated even his transhuman physiology. These episodes were known to his command squad and the Legion's apothecaries, but attributed to after effects of his difficult transformation into an Astartes. Only Sevatar himself understood their true cause, and he kept this knowledge buried as deeply as the abilities that triggered them. Beyond his precognitive abilities, Sevatar possessed an innate talent for psychological manipulation that made him a formidable interrogator. While many Night Lords relied on simple torture to extract information, Sevatar developed more sophisticated approaches that targeted the mind rather than merely the body. These techniques proved effective against not just enemy combatants, but also potential allies and even fellow Night Lords when circumstances required. Sevatar's interrogation methodology began with exhaustive intelligence gathering. Before ever meeting a subject, he would assemble detailed profiles of their personal history, relationships, cultural background, and psychological vulnerabilities. This preparation allowed him to approach each interrogation with a customized strategy rather than relying on generic pain compliance techniques. For subjects motivated by ideology or duty, Sevatar employed cognitive dissonance tactics, presenting evidence that their cause had already failed, that their leaders had abandoned them, or that their sacrifices were meaningless. He would intersperse verifiable truths with carefully crafted lies, making it impossible for the subject to distinguish between reliable and false information. As doubt crept in, Sevatar would offer selective concessions, small comforts, or apparent respect that created psychological dependency. When dealing with subjects motivated by self-interest, Sevatar took a different approach. Rather than attempting to break their loyalty, he would align himself with their ambitions, presenting cooperation as the most advantageous option. He would identify the subject's desires, whether for wealth, power, or simple survival, and construct scenarios where providing information became the rational choice. These scenarios were often elaborate deceptions, but delivered with such conviction that even skeptical subjects would eventually calculate that cooperation offered better odds than resistance. The effectiveness of these methods was demonstrated during the interrogation of Governor Helath Tiber following the compliance action on Bastion Primus. Tiber, a veteran Imperial Army officer before his gubernatorial appointment, had received training in resisting conventional interrogation. When physical coercion proved ineffective, Sevatar was assigned to extract the location of the planet's hidden weapons caches. Rather than escalating the torture, Sevatar changed tactics completely. He had Tiber moved from the detention cells to guest quarters, provided medical treatment for his injuries, and began a series of conversational meetings where he discussed imperial politics and military strategy as though with a respected colleague. Over several days, he built a rapport with Tiber while subtly introducing information, suggesting that the governor's political rivals on neighboring worlds were using the compliance action to undermine his position permanently. By the 8th day, Tiber was voluntarily providing information about the weapons caches, believing that cooperating with Sevatar offered his best chance of salvaging his political future. The first captain extracted not just the locations of the hidden arsenals, but also detailed intelligence about political factions across the sector that proved valuable in subsequent compliance operations. Not a single additional act of physical torture was required. Sevatar applied similar psychological acuity to his management of the Night Lord's command structure. He understood that the Legion's culture of competition and predatory hierarchy created constant potential for internal conflict. Rather than attempting to eliminate this aspect of their nature, an impossible task given their Nostraman heritage and gene-seed tendencies, Sevatar channeled it in directions that served the Legion's objectives. The Atrementor stood apart even among the specialized formations of the Legion's Astartes. While many legions maintained elite Terminator cadres, the Night Lord's premier formation transcended mere battlefield role to become something more significant, a representation of the Legion's darkest aspects refined to lethal perfection. Under Sevatar's command, this formation evolved from a simple heavy assault unit into perhaps the most feared Terminator formation of the Great Crusade. The origins of the Atrementor predated Sevatar's command, initially formed shortly after Curze's reunion with the 8th Legion. Recognizing the psychological impact of Terminator armor, its implacable advance and seemingly unstoppable resilience, the Night Haunter authorized the creation of a dedicated Terminator formation to serve as his personal guard and shock troops. The name Atramentor derived from ancient Nostraman, roughly translating to the Midnight Clad, or those of absolute darkness, reflecting both their appearance and their tactical role. When Sevatar assumed command as first captain, he inherited leadership of the Atramentor as part of his office. While some first captains delegated command of their elite formations to trusted lieutenants, Sevatar took direct personal control of the Atramentor, recognizing their potential beyond mere battlefield application. Under his guidance, the unit was restructured and expanded from its original complement of 30 battle brothers to nearly 100 Terminator armored warriors, an unusually large concentration of such valuable war assets within a single formation. Sevatar's selection process for the Atramentor differed markedly from the practices of other legions. While most elite formations recruited based primarily on combat prowess, Sevatar sought specific psychological profiles. Potential Atramentor needed to demonstrate not just skill in battle, but also tactical acumen, psychological resilience, and the ability to inspire terror through presence rather than mere brutality. Most importantly, they needed to function effectively under Sevatar's direct command, adapting to his unconventional leadership style and rapid tactical shifts. The initiation into the Atramentor combined practical assessment with psychological conditioning. Candidates underwent a grueling series of combat trials in the fighting pits of the Nightfall, facing existing Atramentor in unarmored combat to demonstrate their fundamental martial skills. Those who survived these initial trials were then subjected to isolation in the ship's darkest holds, sometimes for weeks, with random exposures to various fear stimuli. This process identified those who could not only endure fear but weaponize it, a critical trait for Night Lord's elite. The final stage of selection involved a direct assessment by Sevatar himself. The first captain would personally evaluate each candidate, sometimes through combat, other times through conversation, seeking to determine whether they possessed the particular combination of controlled savagery and tactical discipline he demanded. Many otherwise qualified warriors failed at this stage, rejected by Sevatar's inscrutable standards. Those who passed received their Terminator armor in a ceremony notable for its Spartan efficiency. No speeches, no accolades, merely the presentation of war gear and a single instruction. Become fear incarnate. The war gear of the Atramentor under Sevatar's command reflected both their elite status and their specialized tactical role. Their cataphractii pattern Terminator armor was modified extensively by the Legion's Tech Marines, incorporating unique features designed specifically for the Night Lord's approach to warfare. The standard gleaming ceramite was replaced with a light-absorbing matte black finish that rendered them nearly invisible in low-light conditions. Skull-faced helmets incorporated enhanced auto-senses that provided superior night vision capabilities, allowing the Atramentor to operate in complete darkness with the same efficiency other Astartes displayed in daylight. Most distinctively, the Atramentor's armor incorporated sophisticated sound dampening technology, a feature rarely seen in the notoriously noisy Terminator plate. These modifications allowed the Atramentor to move with surprising stealth despite their massive armor, enabling them to appear seemingly from nowhere despite their imposing bulk. The psychological impact of Terminator armored warriors materializing from shadows without warning became a signature effect of Atramentor operations. Weapon loadouts for the Atramentor varied based on mission parameters, but typically favored a mix of ranged firepower and devastating close combat capability. Many Atramentor carried paired lightning claws, a weapon choice that reflected Sevatar's preference for precision over brute force. Others wielded chain fists or power weapons specifically designed to breach fortifications and void ship bulkheads. For ranged combat, heavy flamers were favored for their psychological impact and effectiveness in confined spaces, while combi bolters provided sustained suppressive fire capability. Beyond standard weapons, the Atrementor frequently employed specialized equipment for void operations. Melta charges for breaching sealed compartments, magnetic boots for zero-gravity assaults, and specially formulated gas weapons designed to function in the artificial atmospheres of spacecraft, all featured in their arsenal. Under Sevatar's direction, the Legion's Tech Marines also developed unique grapnel systems that allowed Terminator armored warriors to rapidly traverse the vertical spaces common in starship architecture, a capability that repeatedly surprised enemies who believed the massive armor would limit mobility in such environments. The tactical doctrine Sevatar developed for the Atrementor represented a significant evolution from traditional Terminator deployment methods. While most legions utilized their Terminators as anvils, implacable advance forces that anchored battle lines, Sevatar employed the Atrementor as both hammer and scalpel, adapting their role based on operational requirements and psychological objectives. For planetary assaults, Sevatar pioneered what came to be known as terror insertion tactics. Rather than deploying Terminators en masse at the main point of conflict, he would insert small teams of Atrementor deep behind enemy lines, targeting command structures, power generation facilities, and communication hubs. These teams would operate with near-complete autonomy, creating havoc that forced enemy commanders to divert resources away from the main battle line. The psychological impact of knowing that nowhere, not even the most heavily defended headquarters, was safe from the Atrementor's reach often proved more devastating than their actual combat actions. In void warfare, where the Atrementor truly excelled, Sevatar developed the Phantom Breach methodology that became standard Night Lord's practice for ship-to-ship assaults. This approach began with multiple simultaneous boarding actions, only one of which contained actual Atrementor. As defending forces concentrated on repelling what they perceived as the main threat, the Atrementor would breach at a seemingly secondary location, achieving deep penetration before defenders realized their error. By the time enemy commanders adjusted their response, the Atrementor would have already secured critical systems or executed key personnel. The effectiveness of these tactics was demonstrated during the compliance of the Forge World Cath Tulian, where the planetary defense forces had prepared extensive anti-Astartes countermeasures based on previous encounters with Legion forces. These defenses included hardened command bunkers, distributed communication systems, and specialized weapons designed to penetrate Astartes' armor. Rather than engaging these defenses directly, Sevatar deployed the Atrementor in an unexpected manner, inserting them via supply tunnels beneath the main forge complexes, pathways considered too narrow for Terminator armor. The Tech Marines of the Atrementor had modified their armor specifically for this operation, removing certain external plating to reduce their profile. Moving through maintenance ducts and waste disposal channels, the Atrementor bypassed all outer defenses and emerged directly into the central Forge Cathedral, where the planet's ruling magi had gathered to coordinate resistance. 27 Terminator armored Night Lords materialized from service doors and ventilation shafts, surrounding the Mechanicum leaders before they even realized their inner sanctum had been breached. The planet surrendered within hours, with minimal damage to its valuable production facilities. This operation highlighted another key aspect of Sevatar's doctrine for the Atrementor, the principle of targeted decapitation over mass destruction. While the Atrementor possessed the firepower to inflict tremendous damage, Sevatar recognized that their greatest value lay in precision operations against high-value targets. By eliminating leadership elements and destroying symbolic objectives, the Atrementor could achieve compliance with far less expenditure of resources than would be required for conventional warfare. The reputation of the Atrementor grew with each campaign, spreading beyond military circles to become part of the cultural consciousness of newly compliant worlds. Stories of skull-faced giants emerging from shadows to claim the lives of the non-compliant became common across sectors where the Night Lords operated. Sevatar actively cultivated these myths, occasionally deploying Atrementor for operations whose primary purpose was to reinforce their fearsome reputation rather than achieve specific military objectives. One such operation occurred on Karsus Prime, where a single squad of Atrementor was deployed to the planet's capital city following rumors of sedition among the Planetary Governor's Council. No shots were fired, no buildings breached. The Terminators simply stood in the central plaza for 23 hours, motionless, their skull-faced helmets turned toward the governmental palace. By morning, 3 council members had committed suicide, and 7 others had transmitted confessions of treasonous activities. The governor himself requested Legion assistance in reorganizing his government. The Atrementor departed without having engaged in a single act of violence. Their presence alone had achieved complete compliance. Before the heresy, the Atrementor participated in several major campaigns that cemented their reputation within the Legion's Astartes. During the Genna massacre, where the Night Lords exterminated the population of an entire world in response to rebellion, the Atrementor served not as executioners but as sentinels, containing any attempt at escape with methodical efficiency. While other Night Lords indulged in increasingly sadistic displays, the Atrementor maintained their disciplined approach, killing without cruelty but also without mercy, a reflection of Sevatar's influence on their operational doctrine. The pacification of Daromer saw the Atrementor deployed in their full strength for the first time, spearheading an assault on the planet's orbital defense platforms. Moving with surprising coordination for such heavily armored warriors, they breached the command deck of each platform simultaneously, neutralizing the defense grid before planetary forces could respond. The operation was notable for its precision. Civilian casualties among station personnel were minimal, but every military officer above the rank of lieutenant was eliminated within 20 minutes of the initial breach. Perhaps the most significant pre-heresy deployment of the Atrementor came during the joint operation with the Dark Angels on Dural's world. The campaign had stalemated due to the enemy's extensive underground fortifications, which negated much of the Legion's Astartes' traditional advantages. While the Dark Angels prepared for a protracted siege, Sevatar proposed an alternative approach. The Atrementor, their armor further modified with specialized breaching equipment, infiltrated the subterranean network through abandoned mining shafts. For 6 days, they operated in complete darkness beneath the planet's surface, navigating by memory and enhanced Auspex readings. Moving in small teams, they systematically collapsed key junctions and sealed escape routes, gradually isolating pockets of resistance from one another. Rather than engaging enemy forces directly, they manipulated life support systems and structural integrity fields, forcing defenders to choose between surrender and slow suffocation. By the 7th day, enemy forces began emerging from their bunkers to surrender to the Dark Angels on the surface, unaware that their defeat had been orchestrated by fewer than 60 Atrementor operating in the darkness below. The success of this operation caught the attention of the Lion himself, who requested a detailed briefing on the Atrementor's methodology. The subsequent exchange between Sevatar and the Primarch of the First Legion was not recorded in detail, but observers noted that the typically reserved Lion displayed unusual interest in the Night Lord's tactical innovations. Several Dark Angels officers later incorporated elements of the Atrementor's approach into their own Terminator deployments, particularly for operations against fortified positions. Sevatar's leadership style profoundly influenced the development of the Atrementor, shaping not just their tactical approach but their identity within the Legion. Unlike many commanders who led from a distance, Sevatar consistently placed himself at the forefront of Atrementor operations, sharing the same risks and hardships as his warriors. This direct leadership created intense personal loyalty that transcended the typical bonds of Legion brotherhood. The Thramma's Crusade represented the Night Lord's Legion at its most strategically significant during the opening stages of the Horus Heresy. As loyalist and traitor forces separated across the galaxy, War Master Horus recognized the need to neutralize specific legions that posed the greatest threat to his rebellion. The Dark Angels, with their formidable fleet and unmatched martial prowess, were identified as a priority target that needed to be contained before they could reinforce Terra. Konrad Curze, having fully committed to Horus's rebellion, was tasked with leading the Night Lords against Lion El'Janssen's First Legion in the Aegis subsector. This assignment was not arbitrary. Horus understood that conventional warfare against the methodical and disciplined Dark Angels would likely fail. The Night Lord's asymmetric approach and psychological warfare tactics offered the best chance to delay and disrupt the Dark Angels without requiring a decisive victory. Sevatar approached this campaign with his characteristic pragmatism. He harbored no illusions about defeating the Dark Angels in direct confrontation, recognizing that the Night Lords lacked both the numbers and heavy armor assets to match the First Legion in conventional battle. Instead, he developed a strategy of constant harassment, hit-and-run attacks, and targeted strikes against logistics and communication assets, a campaign designed not to win, but to entangle the Dark Angels in an endless series of inconclusive engagements. The Aegis subsector provided an ideal environment for these tactics. A densely populated region with dozens of inhabited systems, connected by well-established shipping lanes, it offered countless opportunities for ambush and evasion. Sevatar divided the Night Lord's fleet into numerous small battle groups, each operating semi-autonomously under mission-type orders. This distributed approach prevented the Dark Angels from concentrating their superior firepower against the main Night Lord's strength. Sevatar's tactical acumen in void warfare became particularly evident during the Battle of Sheol Station. The Dark Angels had established a forward base in this abandoned mining facility, using it as a staging point for operations throughout the neighboring systems. Rather than attacking the station directly, Sevatar orchestrated a series of false Night Lord sightings across 3 nearby systems, drawing away the majority of the Dark Angels' fleet. With the station's defenses reduced, Sevatar personally led the Atrementor in a precision strike. Using modified boarding torpedoes with minimal energy signatures, they approached the station from the direction of the system's asteroid belt, masking their approach among the natural debris. The Dark Angels detected the incoming torpedoes only seconds before impact, too late to mount an effective defense. The Atrementor breached the station at 12 different points simultaneously, creating confusion about the main thrust of the attack. While the defenders responded to what appeared to be the primary assault on the command deck, Sevatar led a small team to the station's reactor control chamber. Rather than destroying the reactor outright, which would have alerted the Dark Angels' fleet to return immediately, he implemented a more subtle approach. The reactor was reprogrammed to gradually increase its energy output beyond safety parameters, while the monitoring systems were modified to show normal function. By the time the Dark Angels realized something was wrong, the Atrementor had already withdrawn, leaving behind only dead defenders and a compromised reactor approaching critical failure. The resulting explosion destroyed not just the station, but also 3 Dark Angels vessels that had docked to investigate the communications blackout. The entire operation required fewer than 200 Night Lords and resulted in the loss of over 2,000 Dark Angels and their supporting personnel. This pattern repeated across the subsector. Dark Angels' assets would be isolated, attacked with overwhelming force, and then the Night Lords would disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Sevatar rarely employed the same tactic twice, forcing the Dark Angels to prepare for countless possible attack vectors without being able to predict where the next strike would come. The void engagement at Perdidus Binary showcased Sevatar's unconventional approach to fleet combat. The Night Lords had detected a Dark Angels supply convoy moving through the system, protected by a substantial escort including 2 battle barges. Conventional wisdom would suggest avoiding such a well-defended target, but Sevatar saw an opportunity for psychological warfare. Rather than attacking the convoy directly, Sevatar deployed the Night Lord's ships in an unusual formation at the system's Manville Point, the location where vessels would transition from warp to real space. The formation appeared to be an obvious trap, so conspicuous that the Dark Angels commander dismissed it as a feint, assuming the real attack would come from another direction. This assumption played directly into Sevatar's plan. As the Dark Angels convoy adjusted course to avoid the perceived trap, they moved into the shadow of Perdidus II, temporarily blocking their auspex returns to the rear of the formation. In this brief sensor shadow, Sevatar launched a single strike craft carrying a specialized payload, not explosives, but a modified Vox transmitter that attached to the hull of the rearmost supply ship. For the next 3 days, as the convoy continued toward its destination, the transmitter broadcast a continuous signal on the Dark Angel's command frequency, the sound of slow, deliberate breathing interspersed with occasional whispered phrases in Nostraman. The psychological effect on the convoy's crew was devastating. Sleep became impossible for many, and tension rose to the point that weapons were discharged at phantom contacts. By the time the convoy reached its destination, 2 ships had been damaged by friendly fire, and 1 had been abandoned after its crew mutinied. Not a single Night Lord's vessel had engaged the convoy directly, yet the mission was accomplished, supplies were delayed, morale was damaged, and the Dark Angels were forced to implement time-consuming security protocols for all future convoys. This operation exemplified Sevatar's understanding that against a superior force, victory came not from destroying enemy assets, but from forcing the enemy to waste resources securing themselves against attacks that might never come. Throughout the Thrama's crusade, Sevatar maintained regular communication with Curze, though these interactions grew increasingly challenging as the Primarch's mental state deteriorated. The Night Haunter's prophetic visions intensified during this period, becoming more frequent and more disturbing. He would often seclude himself for days, emerging haggard and even more unstable, with new predictions of doom and betrayal. Sevatar approached these episodes with a pragmatic concern rather than the superstitious awe many Night Lords displayed toward their Primarch's foresight. He recognized that while Curze's visions often contained valuable strategic insights, they were filtered through the Primarch's increasingly paranoid worldview. When Curze predicted that the Lion would attempt to capture rather than kill him, Sevatar took the core warning seriously while disregarding the elaborate conspiracy Curze believed underpinned it. This selective interpretation of Curze's prophecies allowed Sevatar to maintain the Legion's strategic focus despite their Primarch's erratic leadership. When Curze became fixated on personal vendettas or symbolic targets with little military value, Sevatar would appear to comply while redirecting the bulk of the Legion's resources toward more practical objectives. This delicate balancing act, honoring the letter of Curze's commands while sometimes subverting their spirit, required both political skill and the absolute loyalty of key officers who understood the necessity of this approach. The relationship between Sevatar and Curze during this period was captured in a conversation recorded by Varjahan, a Legion apothecary who attended to the Primarch during one of his episodes. Following a particularly violent seizure, Curze had described seeing his own death at the hands of an Imperial assassin, a vision that would ultimately prove accurate. When asked for his response, Sevatar reportedly said, "Then we should kill all the assassins, or avoid them, or perhaps ensure you die by some other means, just to spite the vision." This characteristic irreverence masked a deeper concern, but also reflected Sevatar's refusal to accept prophecy as immutable fate. As the Thrama's crusade progressed, Sevatar became increasingly concerned about Curze's fixation on Lion El'Jonson personally. The Primarch's tactical decisions grew more focused on provoking and engaging his brother directly, often at the expense of strategic objectives. While Sevatar recognized the psychological value of targeting enemy leadership, he also understood that direct confrontation between Primarchs favored the Dark Angels, whose Primarch remained stable and focused compared to the increasingly erratic Night Haunter. Despite these concerns, when Curze devised a plan to ambush the Lion, Sevatar committed fully to ensuring its success. The opportunity came at Sagualsa, a dead world that had become the Night Lord's temporary base of operations. Intelligence suggested that the Dark Angels had finally located this base and were preparing a massive assault to end the Thrama's crusade decisively. Rather than evacuating or preparing conventional defenses, Curze proposed using the planet as bait for a trap, not for the Dark Angels as a whole, but specifically for their Primarch. Sevatar's contribution to this plan demonstrated his tactical flexibility and understanding of Lion El'Jonson's psychology. Rather than attempting to conceal the Night Lord's presence on Sagualsa, he ensured that specific information was allowed to reach Dark Angel's intelligence, details suggesting that the Night Lords were in disarray, with Curze isolated from his legion due to internal conflict. This played to the Lion's known preference for targeting enemy leadership and his confidence in his superior martial skills. The trap was laid in the ruins of an ancient cathedral complex that had been converted into the Night Lord's command center. Sevatar personally oversaw the preparation of the site, incorporating subtle psychological elements designed to affect the lion's combat performance. The lighting was adjusted to create disorienting shadows, and the acoustics of the chamber were modified to distort sounds in ways that would be imperceptible to normal humans, but potentially disruptive to a Primarch's enhanced senses. When the Dark Angel's fleet arrived in the Tsagualsa system, they found minimal void defenses, another calculated decision by Sevatar. Rather than wasting assets in a space battle they couldn't win, he had dispersed the Night Lord's fleet with orders to regroup at predetermined coordinates after the operation. Only a skeleton force remained in orbit, just enough to make the Dark Angels work for their landing, but not enough to suggest a major defense. As predicted, Lion El'Jonson led the assault personally, bringing his elite Deathwing Terminators to what he believed would be the final confrontation with his unstable brother. The initial stages of the planetfall encountered token resistance, enough to maintain the illusion of defense without seriously impeding the Dark Angels advance toward the cathedral complex. What the Lion didn't realize was that the Night Lords had prepared the entire approach as a gauntlet of psychological warfare. Each encounter was designed not to inflict casualties, but to gradually heighten tension and aggression. Night Lord snipers would fire near Dark Angels officers without hitting them, triggering alert responses that weren't rewarded with actual targets. Recordings of children screaming played from Vox units hidden in abandoned buildings, only to cut off abruptly when investigated. By the time the Lion reached the cathedral complex, his legendary composure had been subtly eroded by hours of these small provocations. Sevatar had positioned the bulk of the remaining Night Lord's forces in concealed locations throughout the complex, with strict orders not to engage until specific conditions were met. Their role was not to defeat the Dark Angels, an impossible task given the disparity in numbers and equipment, but to ensure that once the Lion and Curze were engaged in personal combat, they would remain isolated from outside interference. The ambush itself unfolded almost exactly as planned. Curze confronted the Lion in the central chamber of the cathedral, goading his brother with insights into his character that only another Primarch could perceive. The resulting duel was a masterpiece of violence, two transhuman demigods employing combat skills beyond mortal comprehension. Sevatar observed the initial stages of this confrontation from a concealed position, ready to implement contingency plans if necessary. What Sevatar hadn't anticipated was the ferocity of the Lion's response once fully committed to the fight. The Dark Angels Primarch fought with cold precision that even Curze's foresight struggled to counter. As the duel progressed, it became clear that despite all their preparations, Curze was being gradually outmatched. The Night Haunter's fighting style relied heavily on his prophetic abilities, but the Lion adapted with each exchange, learning to exploit the fractional delay between Curze's visions and his physical responses. Recognizing that the plan was unraveling, Sevatar made a characteristic split-second decision. Rather than allowing Curze to be defeated, which would likely mean the end of both the Primarch and the Night Lords as an effective fighting force, he ordered the premature activation of the complex's defense protocols. Sections of the cathedral were deliberately collapsed, not to harm the Dark Angels, but to separate the dueling Primarchs before a decisive outcome could be reached. In the confusion that followed, Sevatar led the Atrementor in a precisely coordinated extraction operation. They secured Curze, who had sustained significant injuries during the duel, and withdrew through prepared escape tunnels, while the rest of the Night Lords engaged in delaying actions against the Dark Angels. The extraction was successful, but came at a heavy cost. Nearly a third of the Legion's remaining strength was lost covering the retreat. The aftermath of Tsagualsa marked a turning point in the Thrama's crusade. The Night Lords had survived, and technically achieved their objective of preventing the Dark Angels from reinforcing Terra, but they had been severely depleted in the process. More concerning to Sevatar was Curze's reaction to the outcome. Rather than acknowledging the tactical necessity of the withdrawal, the Primarch became fixated on the idea that he had been denied his destiny, either victory or death at his brother's hands. This perception further damaged Curze's already fragile mental state. In the weeks following Sagualsa, he alternated between periods of catatonic withdrawal and manic activity, often disappearing for days before returning with fresh wounds and rambling accounts of solo actions against Dark Angel's outposts. Sevatar found himself increasingly serving not just as first captain, but as the de facto leader of the Legion, issuing orders in Curze's name, while the Primarch pursued his personal vendetta against the Lion. Despite these challenges, Sevatar maintained the Legion's strategic focus on their assigned mission. The Night Lords continued to harass Dark Angel's operations throughout the Aegis subsector, preventing them from breaking free to reinforce Terra. Even with reduced numbers, their terror tactics remained effective, forcing the Dark Angels to commit disproportionate resources to security and convoy protection. The aftermath of the confrontation at Sagualsa left the Night Lord's Legion in disarray. Konrad Curze lay in a comatose state, his transhuman physiology struggling to repair the grievous wounds inflicted by Lion El'Jonson. The Night Haunter's body might eventually heal, but the Legion could not wait. With their Primarch incapacitated and their forces scattered across the Aegis subsector, the Night Lords faced a critical moment of vulnerability. Sevatar recognized the danger immediately. Without Curze's leadership, the already tenuous cohesion of the Legion threatened to dissolve entirely. Company captains would revert to their Nostraman instincts, becoming territorial and self-serving. The mission to contain the Dark Angels would collapse, and Horus's strategic objectives would be compromised. More importantly to Sevatar, the Legion he had helped shape would fragment into competing warbands, their effectiveness as a fighting force permanently diminished. The first captain acted decisively, gathering the senior officers aboard the Nightfall and establishing a clear chain of command with himself at its head. This was not a power grab. Sevatar had never shown interest in command beyond what was necessary to accomplish objectives, but a practical measure to preserve the Legion's operational capacity. He made it clear that this arrangement was temporary, lasting only until Curze recovered or provided new directives. Not all officers accepted this transition smoothly. Krieg Acerbus openly questioned Sevatar's authority, suggesting that leadership should be determined through traditional Nostraman means, combat in the fighting pits. Sevatar's response was characteristic in its brutal efficiency. Rather than engaging in a lengthy debate or accepting the challenge, he ordered Acerbus confined to quarters under Atramentor guard, demonstrating that the luxury of internal power struggles was one the Legion could not afford in their current circumstances. With the command structure temporarily stabilized, Sevatar turned his attention to the immediate tactical situation. The Dark Angels were pressing their advantage, methodically eliminating Night Lords' outposts throughout the subsector. Their methodical approach made their movements predictable, but their overwhelming force made direct confrontation suicidal. Sevatar needed to buy time for Curze to recover, and for the scattered Night Lords' forces to regroup. His solution was a calculated risk. Rather than continuing to evade the Dark Angels or engaging in hopeless last stands, Sevatar deployed most of the Legion's remaining assets in a series of feints and diversionary attacks. Night Lord strike teams hit Dark Angels' supply lines, communication relays, and forward bases, not to hold territory, but to create the impression of a Legion still operating at full capacity. Meanwhile, the bulk of their remaining forces, including the comatose Curze, withdrew to the edges of the subsector to regroup and recover. The strategy worked initially. The Dark Angels diverted significant resources to counter these phantom threats, slowing their methodical advance. However, Lion El'Jonson was not easily deceived. The Primarch of the First Legion recognized the pattern in these attacks and correctly identified them as diversions rather than genuine strategic operations. He adjusted his approach accordingly, focusing his Legion's efforts on locating the Night Lord's actual base of operations rather than responding to each provocation. This shift in Dark Angel's tactics created a dangerous new dynamic. While Sevatar had anticipated that his diversionary strategy would eventually be recognized, he had not expected the Lion to adapt so quickly. The Night Lords suddenly found themselves in a race against time. They needed to complete their regrouping before the Dark Angels located their temporary sanctuary. The situation deteriorated further when Curze's condition worsened. The Night Haunter's wounds had begun to heal, but his mental state upon regaining consciousness was more fractured than ever. He alternated between periods of lucidity, during which he would issue contradictory orders, and episodes of catatonia, where he would stare unblinking at threats only he could perceive. The Legion's apothecaries were at a loss, their knowledge of Primarch physiology insufficient to address what appeared to be a fundamental break in Curze's already unstable psyche. Sevatar found himself in an increasingly untenable position. He needed to maintain the illusion of Legion cohesion, manage Curze's erratic interventions, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation with the Dark Angels. The strain began to manifest in more frequent and severe migraines, the physical manifestation of his suppressed psychic abilities struggling to provide warning of approaching dangers. The breaking point came when a Night Lord strike team failed to return from a mission against a Dark Angels communication array. Initial reports suggested they had been intercepted and destroyed, but Sevatar's instincts told him something more significant had occurred. He ordered a high-risk reconnaissance mission to investigate the team's last known position, personally selecting the Atrementor who would undertake this dangerous assignment. The reconnaissance team returned with alarming news. The missing strike team hadn't been destroyed, they had been captured. More concerning, interrogation of one team member had revealed the location of the Night Lord's temporary base. The Dark Angels were already en route with a substantial fleet, including the flagship Invincible Reason with Lion Eljonson himself leading the assault. Evacuation was impossible. The Night Lords lacked the void assets to transport their forces before the Dark Angels arrived. A conventional defense was equally futile given their depleted numbers. Sevatar needed an unconventional solution, and he needed it immediately. His plan was characteristically audacious. Rather than attempting to defend their position or flee, he would lead a small strike force in a preemptive attack against the Invincible Reason itself, not to destroy the vessel, an impossible objective, but to create confusion and potentially delay the Dark Angels' assault long enough for the bulk of the Night Lords to withdraw to secondary positions. The operation began with a single Night Lord strike cruiser, the Shroud of Consequence, making a high-speed approach toward the Dark Angels' fleet. The vessel's energy signature was modified to appear damaged, as though it were fleeing from battle. As expected, the Dark Angels permitted the apparently crippled vessel to close distance before moving to intercept, not recognizing it as a threat to their flagship. By the time they realized their error, Sevatar and a hand-picked team of Atrementor had already launched in boarding torpedoes, using the confusion of the cruiser's self-destruction as cover for their approach. The torpedoes struck the Invincible Reason at carefully selected points, penetrating its void shields during the momentary recalibration caused by the nearby explosion. The boarding action that followed was not intended as a serious attempt to capture or cripple the Dark Angels' flagship. Such an objective would have been impossible even for the Atrementor at full strength. Instead, Sevatar led his warriors in a precisely targeted strike against the vessel's primary communication array, aiming to disrupt coordination between the flagship and the rest of the Dark Angels' fleet. The initial phase of the operation proceeded according to plan. The Atrementor secured their insertion points and advanced toward the communication center, encountering heavier resistance than anticipated but making steady progress. Sevatar, fighting at the forefront as always, demonstrated why he had earned his reputation as one of the deadliest warriors in the Legion's Astartes. His chainglaive carved through Dark Angels' Astartes with surgical precision, each strike targeting vulnerable points in their armor with unerring accuracy. The operation began to unravel when a contingent of Deathwing Terminators responded to the breach. These elite warriors, the counterparts to Sevatar's own Atrementor, represented a level of opposition that had not been factored into the mission parameters. The narrow corridors of the Invincible Reason negated much of Sevatar's mobility advantage, forcing him into the kind of direct confrontation he typically avoided. What followed was a fighting retreat as Sevatar adjusted his objectives on the fly. The communication array was now unreachable, but there were other ways to create the disruption he needed. He led his remaining Atrementor toward the flagship's secondary reactor control, intending to trigger emergency containment protocols that would force the vessel to temporarily drop from formation. It was during this tactical pivot that disaster struck. As the Night Lords fought their way through increasingly dense resistance, Sevatar experienced the most severe psychic episode of his life, a blinding flash of precognition that showed him the immediate future with perfect clarity. He saw the ambush waiting around the next junction, the hidden heavy weapons that would decimate his remaining warriors, and his own capture. For perhaps the first time in his life, Sevatar hesitated. His instinct was to find an alternative route, to avoid the fate his unwanted gift had revealed. But in that moment of clarity, he also saw the broader strategic picture. His capture would focus Dark Angel's attention on the flagship, creating the very disruption he had intended to achieve through sabotage. The Night Lords on the surface would have their window for evacuation. The decision took less than a heartbeat. Sevatar adjusted his course directly toward the ambush, not warning his attramentor of what lay ahead. When they rounded the junction and faced the massed firepower of an entire Dark Angel's company, the first captain launched himself forward ahead of his warriors, drawing the bulk of fire toward himself. His transhuman reflexes allowed him to dodge the worst of the fusillade, but even Sevatar couldn't evade every round. Multiple bolt shells struck him simultaneously, penetrating his armor at the joints and less protected sections. The impact threw him against a bulkhead, his armor's systems flickering as they struggled to compensate for the damage. Before he could recover, a power maul struck him from behind, delivered by a Dark Angel's officer who had circled during the initial exchange of fire. The blow would have killed an ordinary Astartes instantly. Sevatar's enhanced physiology allowed him to remain conscious, though multiple internal organs had been damaged. He was aware of being restrained, of Dark Angel's Terminators securing him with specialized restraints designed to hold Astartes prisoners. His final act before losing consciousness was to trigger the emergency teleport beacons carried by his surviving attramentor, ensuring their extraction even as he remained behind. Sevatar regained consciousness in a detention cell deep within the Invincible Reason. His armor had been removed and his wounds treated, not out of compassion, but to ensure he survived for interrogation. The cell was designed specifically for Astartes prisoners, with reinforced walls and restraint systems capable of holding even transhuman strength. A null field generator hummed softly in one corner, its presence suggesting the Dark Angels suspected his latent psychic abilities despite his efforts to conceal them. His first visitors were not interrogators, but apothecaries, who conducted a thorough examination to determine his physical condition. They worked in silence, ignoring his sardonic comments about Dark Angel's hospitality. Their methodical approach told Sevatar something important. The Dark Angels wanted information from him, which meant they would keep him alive at least until they had extracted what they needed. The actual interrogation began several hours later, conducted by a Dark Angel's chaplain, whose skull-faced helm mirrored Sevatar's own preferred battle visage. The chaplain introduced himself as Asmodai, a name that meant nothing to Sevatar, but would later become infamous throughout the Imperium for his interrogation techniques. The questioning followed a predictable pattern initially. Asmodai demanded information about Night Lord's deployments, the condition of Konrad Curze, and the Legion's strategic objectives. Sevatar responded with misdirection and sarcasm, revealing nothing of value while assessing his interrogator's methods and temperament. As the interrogation progressed, Asmodai shifted to more philosophical questions, probing Sevatar's understanding of the Night Lord's purpose and his own loyalty to their cause. This approach revealed that the Dark Angels sought more than tactical information. They wanted insight into the psychology of a legion that had turned against the Emperor despite having no apparent grievances or ideological alignment with Horus. It was during one of these philosophical exchanges that Sevatar delivered what would become his most famous statement. When Asmodai questioned how the Night Lords could justify their methods of terror and psychological warfare, suggesting that such tactics betrayed the Emperor's vision for the Legion's Astartes, Sevatar responded with characteristic bluntness. "We have all been Night Lords since the day we were born." The statement contained a profound truth that clearly unsettled the chaplain. Sevatar elaborated, explaining that the Emperor had created the legions as instruments of violence, each specialized for particular applications of force. The Night Lord's methods might be more overtly terroristic than those of other legions, but the fundamental purpose remained the same: compliance through whatever means proved most efficient. The only difference was that the Night Lords acknowledged the nature of their actions rather than shrouding them in noble rhetoric. This exchange marked a turning point in Sevatar's captivity. The Dark Angels recognized that conventional interrogation techniques would yield little of value against a prisoner who understood psychological warfare as intimately as they understood combat doctrine. Instead, they shifted to a strategy of isolation, keeping Sevatar in solitary confinement with minimal interaction beyond basic biological necessities. For most prisoners, this approach would have been devastatingly effective. For Sevatar, it provided an unexpected opportunity. The isolation prevented the migraines that had plagued him with increasing frequency, creating a mental clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Without the constant pressure of command responsibilities and the need to manage Curze's erratic behavior, he found himself able to focus inward, examining his own suppressed abilities for perhaps the first time. The null field generator complicated this self-examination, dampening his psychic potential but not eliminating it entirely. Sevatar began to experiment cautiously, testing the boundaries of his abilities within the constraints of his captivity. He discovered that while precognitive flashes were suppressed by the null field, a subtler form of awareness remained accessible, an intuitive understanding of patterns and probabilities that fell just short of true foresight. This developing awareness allowed him to track ship movements based on subtle vibrations and changes in the artificial gravity. He began to construct a mental map of the invincible reason, identifying patrol patterns and crew rotations by the faint sounds that penetrated his cell. Most importantly, he recognized that the Dark Angels' fleet was no longer in active pursuit of the Night Lords, but had shifted to a defensive posture, suggesting that his sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose. The routine of his captivity was interrupted unexpectedly when a new interrogator arrived, not a Dark Angels officer, but a representative of the Librarius. This development confirmed Sevatar's suspicion that the Dark Angels had identified his latent abilities. The librarian, who did not provide his name, approached the questioning differently than Asmodai had, focusing not on information, but on Sevatar himself. "You've never been trained," the librarian observed after several minutes of silent observation. "Your potential has been left to develop without guidance or control. That makes you dangerous, primarily to yourself." Sevatar responded with his characteristic sarcasm, but the librarian remained unperturbed. He explained that untrained psychers typically followed one of two paths. Their abilities either destroyed them from within, or they learned to channel them through instinct rather than discipline. Sevatar had clearly followed the latter path, but such self-taught techniques were inherently limited and increasingly unstable as the psycher's power grew. This conversation represented the first time anyone had directly addressed Sevatar's abilities without being deflected by denial or misdirection. The librarian's matter-of-fact approach bypassed Sevatar's usual defensive mechanisms, creating a moment of genuine introspection. For perhaps the first time, the first captain considered what it would mean to acknowledge and develop his psychic potential rather than suppressing it. The librarian departed without making demands or offering assistance, leaving Sevatar to consider the implications of their conversation. This brief interaction had a more profound effect than weeks of conventional interrogation, forcing Sevatar to confront aspects of himself he had deliberately avoided examining. The psychological impact of this realization manifested physically. The carefully constructed mental barriers Sevatar had maintained for decades began to weaken, allowing more of his suppressed abilities to surface. Even through the null field, he experienced flashes of awareness that extended beyond his immediate surroundings, glimpses of other parts of the ship, impressions of decisions being made in distant command chambers, fragments of communications he couldn't possibly have heard. These experiences were disorienting and painful, reminiscent of the migraines that had plagued him throughout his life, but with a new dimension of clarity. Sevatar recognized that he stood at a crossroads. He could continue to deny his nature, maintaining the increasingly fragile barriers that had defined his existence, or he could embrace these abilities and accept the transformation that would follow. The decision was made for him when alarms suddenly blared throughout the invincible reason. The distinctive sound of void shield generators powering to maximum capacity told him that the flagship was preparing for imminent attack. Through his developing awareness, Sevatar sensed a surge of activity throughout the vessel, weapons being manned, Astartes mobilizing for potential boarding actions, command protocols being initiated. The Night Lords had returned, not to rescue their captured first captain, but to finish what he had started. The alarms aboard the Invincible Reason were not, as Sevatar had initially surmised, the result of a Night Lord's counterattack. Instead, they signaled something far more unexpected, a massive warp storm that had erupted without warning in the Tsagualsa system. The Dark Angel's flagship shuddered as it adjusted course, its mighty engines straining against the gravitational distortions that preceded full warp translation. For Sevatar, the sudden chaos presented an opportunity he had been patiently cultivating. The disruption caused by emergency protocols meant reduced attention on a prisoner who had thus far yielded little actionable intelligence. More importantly, the power fluctuations accompanying the ship's emergency maneuvers temporarily weakened the null field containing his nascent psychic abilities. With the mental clarity he had developed during his captivity, Sevatar focused on the cell's locking mechanism. Not through telekinesis, his untrained abilities weren't capable of such direct manipulation, but through a subtler application of his gift. He perceived the probability paths of the lock's components, identifying the exact moment when power would cycle through the backup systems. When that moment came, he applied precise physical pressure to the weakest point in the door frame. The timing had to be perfect. A fraction of a second too early or too late, and the opportunity would vanish. Sevatar felt rather than saw the instant approaching, a skill honed through decades of combat precognition now deliberately applied. The cell door slid open just enough for him to force his fingers into the gap and manually override the mechanism. The corridor outside was deserted, crew and Astartes alike occupied with battle stations. Sevatar moved with practiced silence, his bare feet making no sound on the metal deck. Without his armor or weapons, he was vulnerable but still lethal, perhaps more dangerous for being underestimated. He navigated by memory and intuition, avoiding patrols through a combination of calculated timing and his enhanced awareness of movement patterns throughout the ship. His first objective was not escape but equipment. An Astartes without armor was still a transhuman warrior, but Sevatar knew he would need more than his bare hands to leave the flagship. The nearest armory was 3 decks below, accessible through maintenance shafts rather than main corridors. He forced open an access panel and slipped into the narrow confines of the ship's infrastructure, spaces designed for servitors rather than space marines. The journey through the maintenance network was arduous even for his enhanced physiology. Spaces barely large enough for his shoulders required contortion and strength to navigate. Twice he encountered servitors performing repair functions, and each time he disabled them silently, careful not to trigger automated alerts. The effort reopened several of his partially healed wounds, leaving a trail of blood that would eventually be discovered, but by then he intended to be elsewhere. When he finally reached the armory access point, Sevatar paused to assess the situation. His developing psychic awareness suggested 2 dark angels within, not full Astartes, but chapter serfs responsible for weapons maintenance. They would be armed, but not comparable to a space marine in combat capability. More concerning was the likelihood of biometric security systems that would trigger alarms when breached. Sevatar considered his options with characteristic pragmatism. A frontal approach would be quick but noisy. Stealth would take longer but preserve his advantage of surprise for when he would truly need it. He opted for a hybrid approach, using the ventilation system to introduce a controlled power surge to the armory's lighting, then striking in the momentary darkness. The plan worked with mechanical precision. The lights flickered and died, plunging the armory into darkness. Before the emergency lumens could activate, Sevatar had dropped from the ceiling access panel and neutralized both serfs with targeted strikes to the brainstem. Neither had time to trigger alarms or even register his presence before losing consciousness. The armory contained no Night Lord's equipment, but Sevatar had not expected to find his personal war gear. Instead, he selected items based on utility rather than familiarity: a combat knife with a monomolecular edge, a bolt pistol with a full magazine, and a set of scout armor components that would offer some protection without significantly restricting his movement. He also gathered demolition charges and communication equipment that might prove useful in the later stages of his escape. Most importantly, he accessed a data terminal to determine the ship's location and status. The information confirmed his suspicions. The Dark Angel's fleet had broken off pursuit of the scattered Night Lords to respond to new strategic priorities. The heresy was accelerating across the galaxy, and even the methodical Lion had been forced to abandon the Thrama's crusade before achieving complete victory. This meant that Sevatar's sacrifice had served its purpose. The Night Lord's Legion had survived to fight another day. The terminal also provided critical intelligence about the Invincible Reason's current course. The flagship was not heading toward Terra as might be expected, but to a rendezvous point in the Perdita system. This suggested that the Dark Angels were gathering their strength for a major operation, information that would be valuable to the Night Lords and potentially to Horus himself, if Sevatar could deliver it. Armed with both weapons and intelligence, Sevatar moved to the next phase of his escape plan. The flagship's launch bays were too heavily guarded to approach directly, and attempting to commandeer a vessel large enough for warp travel would be impossible. Instead, he targeted a communication array, not to damage it as in his original boarding action, but to transmit a specifically coded signal that would be recognizable to any Night Lord's vessels in the vicinity. Reaching the secondary communication array required traversing more populated sections of the ship. Sevatar moved during shift changes when corridors were busiest, using the confusion of personnel transfers to blend in despite his distinctive height and bearing. When direct confrontation became unavoidable, he employed quick, lethal strikes that left no survivors to raise alarms. Each engagement was calculated to appear as an accident or unexplained disappearance rather than evidence of an escaped prisoner. The communication array was more lightly defended than expected, another benefit of the overall fleet emergency that had diverted resources elsewhere. Sevatar neutralized the two tech adepts manning the station and locked the access doors before they could be discovered. Working quickly, he bypassed security protocols and established a narrow-band transmission on a frequency used by Night Lord scout vessels during the early stages of the Thrama's crusade. The message was brief and encoded in a cipher developed by Sevatar himself, a set of coordinates and a time frame, nothing more. Any Night Lord's commander would recognize it as an extraction request from a high-value asset. Whether anyone would respond remained uncertain, but Sevatar had created the opportunity. Now he needed to survive long enough to exploit it. His actions had not gone unnoticed. By the time he exited the communication array, internal security protocols had identified unauthorized access to multiple systems. The Dark Angels had not yet connected these breaches to their escaped prisoner, but systematic sweeps were already underway. Sevatar needed to reach a position where extraction would be possible, specifically, an external section of the hull where a small craft could briefly dock without being immediately destroyed by the flagship's defensive systems. The path to his chosen extraction point took him through increasingly secure areas of the ship. Twice he was forced to use the demolition charges to create diversions, timing detonations to draw security details away from his intended route. The resulting damage was minimal, but served its purpose, creating confusion and dividing the Dark Angel's response. As he approached the outer hull sections, Sevatar encountered his first Astartes opposition, a patrol of 3 Dark Angels responding to the security breaches. Even armed and partially armored, engaging 3 fully equipped Space Marines would normally be suicidal. Sevatar turned this disadvantage into an asset, attacking with such sudden ferocity that the Dark Angels initially failed to coordinate their response. The fight was brief and brutal. Sevatar targeted the lead Astartes first, driving his combat knife through the eye lens of the warrior's helmet before the others could react. As the wounded Dark Angel staggered backward, Sevatar seized his bolt pistol and fired point-blank into the second warrior's throat seal. The third managed to activate his Vox to call for reinforcements before Sevatar silenced him with a precise shot to the same vulnerable area. The encounter had lasted less than 15 seconds, but the damage was done, the alarm had been raised, and his presence was now confirmed. Extraction had just become significantly more difficult. Sevatar appropriated what equipment he could from the fallen Dark Angels, including a Vox unit that would allow him to monitor their communications. What he heard confirmed his worst expectations. The Lion himself had been informed of his escape and was personally directing the response. Time was now his most precious resource. Sevatar abandoned stealth in favor of speed, moving directly toward his extraction point while using his commandeered Vox to feed false information into the Dark Angels' communication network. He reported sightings of the escaped prisoner in distant sections of the ship, contradictory information about his armament, and exaggerated assessments of damage to critical systems. The resulting confusion bought him precious minutes as he reached the maintenance airlock that was his final destination. The airlock chamber was designed for servitor access to external hull components, too small for normal deployment but adequate for Sevatar's purposes. He sealed himself inside and used the demolition charges to disable the inner door mechanisms, preventing immediate pursuit. The outer door remained operational, controlled by a separate system that he could activate when extraction arrived, if it arrived at all. For nearly 3 hours, Sevatar waited in the confined space of the airlock, monitoring Dark Angels' communications as they systematically eliminated his false leads and narrowed their search to the outer hull sections. His position would eventually be discovered. It was only a matter of time. The question was whether extraction would reach him first. The answer came in the form of a proximity alert on his stolen Vox unit. A small craft had approached the invincible Reason from an oblique angle, using the ongoing warp disturbances to mask its approach. The vessel's profile matched a Night Lord's Darkwing, a stealth craft designed for precisely this kind of high-risk extraction. Sevatar activated the outer airlock door and prepared for the most dangerous part of his escape. The gap between the airlock and the hovering Darkwing was approximately 20 meters, a distance that would expose him to void and potential weapons fire from the flagship's defensive systems. Sevatar calculated the timing with characteristic precision, waiting until the Dark Angels' search pattern created a momentary blind spot in their coverage. When that moment came, he launched himself across the void separating the vessels. The journey took less than 10 seconds, but they were perhaps the longest of Sevatar's life. The vacuum pulled at his lungs and froze the moisture on his eyes, while radiation from the nearby warp disturbance created painful interference with his enhanced senses. Just as his consciousness began to fade, he felt armored hands grasp his limbs and pull him into the Darkwing's airlock. His rescuers were not, as he might have expected, members of his Atramentor. Instead, he found himself facing a squad of Night Lords he recognized as part of Zo Sahal's command, the Talon Master's personal hunters. Their presence raised immediate questions about the Legion's current command structure and Sahal's motives, but those concerns would wait. For now, survival took priority as the Darkwing accelerated away from the Dark Angels' flagship, using the warp disturbances as cover for its escape. The vessel did not immediately return to Night Lord's territory. Instead, it followed a circuitous route through several systems, ensuring they had truly evaded pursuit before making contact with the scattered remnants of the Legion. During this journey, Sevatar recovered from his injuries and debriefed the extraction team, learning the current state of the Night Lords in his absence. The news was mixed. Curze had eventually recovered from his wounds, but his mental state had deteriorated further. The Primarch now spent most of his time in isolation, emerging only to lead particularly brutal attacks that seemed designed more to satisfy his personal bloodlust than achieve strategic objectives. In his absence, the Legion had indeed begun to fragment, with company captains establishing their own power bases and interpreting Curze's infrequent commands according to their own ambitions. Most concerning was the news that the Night Lords had effectively abandoned their assigned role in Horus's strategic plan. Rather than continuing to tie down the Dark Angels, many captains had redirected their forces toward targets of opportunity, wealthy systems that could be plundered, or personal vendettas against Imperial commanders who had slighted them in the past. The disciplined terror tactics that Sevatar had cultivated were being replaced by wanton destruction and sadism. This fragmentation explained why his extraction had been conducted by Sahal's forces rather than his own Atramentor. The elite Terminator formation had maintained its cohesion in his absence, but had been deployed by Curze on a separate mission, details of which remained classified even to the extraction team. Sevatar's position as first captain technically remained intact, but in practical terms, his authority had been severely undermined during his captivity. As the Darkwing finally rendezvoused with a Night Lord strike cruiser in the Nostromo sector, Sevatar faced a critical decision. He could attempt to reassert his authority over the fragmented Legion, potentially coming into conflict with captains who had grown accustomed to autonomy. Alternatively, he could focus on his direct responsibilities to Curze, serving as the stabilizing influence the Primarch so desperately needed. Or he could pursue a third path, one that acknowledged the Legion's transformation and adapted to it rather than fighting against it. The strike cruiser's destination was not, as Sevatar might have expected, a Legion gathering point. Instead, it was on course for a system on the fringes of the Ghoul Stars, far from the main theaters of the Heresy. When he questioned this heading, the ship's captain provided a sealed data slate containing orders directly from Curze himself. The contents of these orders would determine Sevatar's path forward, and potentially the fate of the Night Lord's Legion in the wars to come. The death of Jago Sevatarion remains a subject of historical contention within the annals of Imperial records. Some accounts claim he perished during the later stages of the Horus Heresy, while others suggest he survived to participate in the Legion wars that followed. The Night Lords themselves perpetuate contradictory stories, perhaps deliberately, as befits their reputation for psychological warfare. What remains undisputed, however, is the enduring impact Sevatar left on the Night Lord's Legion long after his physical presence ceased to guide them. In the fragmented warband structure that emerged following Konrad Curze's death, Sevatar's tactical doctrines became the closest thing the Night Lords had to a unifying philosophy. Company captains who had once chafed under his authority found themselves implementing his methods, often without conscious acknowledgement of their source. The precision terror tactics he had refined during the Great Crusade proved remarkably adaptable to the guerrilla warfare that characterized Night Lords' operations in the post-Heresy era. The most evident continuation of Sevatar's influence appeared in void warfare operations. His approach to ship-to-ship combat, emphasizing targeted strikes against command and communication systems rather than attempting to cripple enemy vessels through conventional damage, became standard practice among Night Lords shipmasters. The Phantom Breach methodology he pioneered during the Thramma's crusade evolved into increasingly sophisticated variants, with some warbands specializing exclusively in void-based terror tactics that could trace their lineage directly to Sevatar's original innovations. On Coraline Prime in the late 32nd millennium, the Night Lords warband known as the Screaming Skulls executed an operation that demonstrated this tactical lineage with remarkable clarity. Rather than attacking the planet's substantial orbital defenses directly, they inserted small teams into 3 separate defense platforms through supply shuttles. These teams didn't attempt to capture the platforms, but instead manipulated their targeting systems to create the appearance of catastrophic malfunction. When the platforms began firing on friendly vessels, the resulting confusion allowed the Night Lords to slip past the defensive perimeter without engaging in direct combat. The operation's architect, a warband leader called Kranos, explicitly credited Sevatar's doctrines in his personal war journals, noting that the first captain understood that fear of failure often proves more devastating than fear of the enemy. Perhaps more significant than specific tactical innovations was Sevatar's broader strategic philosophy, the understanding that terror functioned most effectively when applied with precision rather than indiscriminately. While many Night Lords devolved into wanton sadism after the Heresy, those warbands that maintained the greatest combat effectiveness were invariably those that adhered to Sevatar's doctrine of targeted psychological warfare. These warbands recognized, as Sevatar had, that terror was a means to an end rather than an objective in itself. The Night Lords warband, known as the Exalted Court, exemplified this approach during their systematic dismantling of imperial governance in the Orpheus sector during the 34th millennium. Rather than engaging in widespread civilian massacres, they conducted precisely targeted killings of administrative officials, creating a pattern that made it clear that only those who actively supported imperial rule were at risk. This selective application of violence caused a wave of resignations across the sector, as officials chose abandonment of duty over potential targeting. Within a year, imperial governance had collapsed across 17 worlds, without the Night Lords having to engage in a single significant military confrontation. Beyond tactical doctrines, Sevatar's leadership style left an equally important legacy. His pragmatic approach to command, emphasizing results over ideological purity, created a template for warband leaders who sought effectiveness rather than merely indulging their darker impulses. The Prince of Crows had never been motivated by the same religious fervor that drove many chaos-aligned forces, nor by the bitter hatred of the Imperium that consumed Curze in his final years. Instead, he approached warfare as a practical exercise in achieving objectives through the most efficient application of available resources. This pragmatism manifested in the unusual willingness of certain Night Lords' warbands to form temporary alliances with other forces, even occasionally with Imperial factions when circumstances warranted. The warband led by Krieg Acerbus, once Sevatar's rival, ironically adopted this aspect of the first captain's approach most completely. During the 13th Black Crusade, Acerbus's forces coordinated operations with both word-bearers and Alpha Legion elements, maintaining their distinct tactical identity while integrating into broader strategic objectives. This flexibility gave his warband disproportionate influence despite their relatively modest numbers. Sevatar's complex relationship with Konrad Curze also shaped how subsequent Night Lords leaders interpreted their legion's purpose after the Primarch's death. Unlike many first captains who served as unquestioning extensions of their Primarch's will, Sevatar had maintained a degree of independence from Curze's increasingly nihilistic worldview. This created a precedent for Night Lords commanders to define their own objectives rather than being bound by inherited purpose, a characteristic that proved valuable in adapting to the constantly shifting landscape of the post-Heresy galaxy. The fragmentation of the Night Lords following Curze's death has often been attributed to the absence of a clear succession plan or designated heir. However, this interpretation overlooks the possibility that the fragmentation itself reflected Sevatar's influence. The first captain had never attempted to impose rigid uniformity on the Legion, instead creating a framework within which different companies could operate according to their strengths while maintaining overall strategic coherence. When this framework collapsed after Curze's death, the Legion naturally separated into distinct warbands that functioned as smaller versions of the flexible structure Sevatar had created. This perspective suggests that the current state of the Night Lords, a collection of independent warbands that occasionally cooperate for specific objectives, might represent not a failure of Legion cohesion, but an adaptation to circumstances that preserves their effectiveness despite their reduced numbers. Each warband essentially functions as Sevatar envisioned company-level operations, autonomous but capable of integration into larger efforts when required. The myths and legends that developed around Sevatar in the millennia following his disappearance reflect the Night Lord's traditional appreciation for psychological impact over historical accuracy. Within the Legion, stories of the Prince of Crows grew increasingly elaborate, attributing to him impossible feats and supernatural abilities that transcended even his actual considerable skills. These myths served a practical purpose, providing warband leaders with a symbolic figure whose invocation could inspire both fear in enemies and respect among their own warriors. One persistent legend claims that Sevatar did not die, but instead retreated into the depths of the warp, where he continues to observe the Night Lords and occasionally manifests to guide worthy warband leaders. Another suggests that he foresaw the Legion's fragmentation and deliberately established hidden caches of knowledge and equipment across the galaxy, accessible only to those who properly understand his tactical philosophies. While no credible evidence supports these claims, they demonstrate how Sevatar's persona transformed from historical figure to mythic archetype within Legion culture. Among the broader forces of chaos, Sevatar occupies an unusual position in their mythology, respected for his effectiveness, but viewed with suspicion for his apparent lack of ideological commitment. Wordbearer's texts refer to him as the unconverted blade, acknowledging his martial prowess while lamenting his resistance to embracing the deeper meanings of chaos. This perception accurately reflects Sevatar's historical approach. He accepted the Night Lord's alliance with Horus as a practical necessity rather than a spiritual awakening. This pragmatic legacy created space within Night Lord's culture for warbands to maintain relationships with chaos that range from fervent devotion to mere convenience. Unlike many Traitor Legions that developed relatively uniform religious practices after turning from the Emperor, Night Lord's warbands display remarkable diversity in their spiritual inclinations. Some have embraced specific chaos powers, others maintain the secular approach that characterized Sevatar's leadership, and still others have developed unique belief systems that incorporate elements of Nostraman culture with various chaos influences. Perhaps the most tangible aspect of Sevatar's legacy lies in his creation and development of the Atrementor. This elite Terminator formation established a template that Night Lord's warbands have emulated for 10,000 years, creating their own versions adapted to their specific needs and resources. The original Atrementor may have disbanded after Sevatar's disappearance, but their approach to warfare, combining overwhelming force with psychological impact, continues to influence how Night Lords deploy their most valuable assets. The warband known as the Nightfall Brotherhood maintains what they claim is the most direct lineage to the original Atrementor. Their Terminator elite, called the Shroud Brethren, employ modified Terminator armor with the same sound-dampening technology and light-absorbent coating that characterized Sevatar's original formation. Their operational doctrine emphasizes the same combination of psychological warfare and precision strikes, targeting enemy leadership and symbolic objectives rather than engaging in frontal assaults. Whether their claimed lineage is historically accurate remains impossible to verify, but their operational effectiveness suggests they have at least successfully preserved the tactical principles that made the original Atrementor so formidable. Other warbands have adapted the Atrementor template to their specific circumstances and available resources. The Crimson Talons maintain a formation called the Void Wraiths, who utilize salvaged Terminator components combined with more readily available power armor to create hybrid suits that sacrifice some protection for increased mobility. The Night Harvest warband fields the Obsidian Guard, who eschew the stealth aspects of the original Atrementor in favor of psychological impact, adorning their Terminator plate with elaborate trophies taken from significant kills. Despite these variations, all such formations share the fundamental understanding that elite troops are most effective when employed for specific high-impact operations rather than as conventional line units. The standardization of these elite formations represents a significant departure from Sevatar's original approach in one important aspect: their selection criteria. Where Sevatar chose Atrementor candidates based on psychological profile and tactical acumen as much as combat prowess, many post-Heresy formations select purely on the basis of battlefield performance. This shift reflects the broader changes in Night Lord's culture, the gradual prioritization of individual achievement over collective effectiveness that characterized the Legion's transformation into warbands. Some warband leaders recognized this limitation and attempted to correct it. Talos Valkoran, who rose to prominence in the late 41st millennium, explicitly referenced Sevatar's selection methodology when forming his own inner circle of elite warriors. Rather than choosing based solely on kill tallies or combat honors, he sought individuals who demonstrated the capacity for both independent action and seamless integration into coordinated operations, the same balance Sevatar had valued in his Atrementor. While Valkoran never commanded resources sufficient to field a true Terminator formation, his approach to leadership demonstrated a conscious attempt to recapture elements of Sevatar's command philosophy. The fragmentation of the Night Lords following Curze's death produced competing interpretations of Sevatar's legacy, each emphasized by different factions within the Legion. those warbands that maintained closest fidelity to Nostrum and cultural traditions, emphasized his role as the last true first captain, portraying him as the final embodiment of the Legion's original purpose before corruption and fragmentation took hold. Others, particularly those who embraced chaos more fully, recast him as a visionary who recognized the limitations of imperial doctrine and laid groundwork for the Legion's eventual liberation from the Emperor's control. These competing narratives reflect the fundamental tension that characterized Sevatar himself, a warrior who served a Primarch he didn't fully believe in, leading a legion whose methods he implemented while questioning their purpose. This complexity made his legacy adaptable to the needs of different Night Lords factions, each able to find elements that supported their particular interpretation of the Legion's purpose. Despite these varying interpretations, certain aspects of Sevatar's influence remained consistent across all Night Lords' warbands. His emphasis on precision over indiscriminate violence, psychological warfare over mere physical destruction, and tactical flexibility over doctrinal rigidity created a foundation that even the most divergent warbands built upon. In this sense, while the Night Lords' Legion as a coherent entity may have died with Konrad Curze, the operational methodology that made them effective survived through Sevatar's legacy. The ultimate testament to Sevatar's influence lies not in monuments or formal doctrines. The Night Lords have little use for either, but in the continued effectiveness of their operations 10 millennia after his disappearance. When Imperial commanders face Night Lords' warbands in the 41st millennium, they encounter tactical approaches that would be recognizable to veterans of the Thrama's crusade. The precision targeting of leadership, the manipulation of communication systems, the creation of terror through implication rather than mere atrocity, all bear the unmistakable imprint of the Prince of Crow's approach to warfare. The Imperial historical record concerning Jago Sevatarion presents a study in contradiction and careful omission. Unlike many Traitor Legion commanders whose names were systematically expunged from official histories, Sevatar occupies an unusual position in Imperial documentation. References to the Prince of Crows appear in classified inquisitorial archives, tactical analyses by the Adeptus Astartes, and even CERT-approved historical texts, though always carefully contextualized to serve the Imperium's narrative needs. The earliest surviving Imperial records of Sevatar come from Great Crusade expedition logs, where his tactical innovations during compliance actions were documented by Imperial Army observers. These accounts, now sealed in the deepest vaults of Terra, describe his methods with clinical detachment that belies their psychological impact. One such report from the compliance of Daromer notes, the Night Lords commander implemented a targeted decapitation strategy that neutralized resistance without conventional engagement. Primary infrastructure remained intact, though governing capability was completely dismantled within 6 hours of initial insertion. What makes these early accounts particularly valuable to Imperial historians is their documentation of Night Lords' operations before the Legion's fall to corruption. They provide insight into the tactical methodology that would later make the Night Lords such a persistent threat to Imperial security. The Inquisition's Ordo Malleus maintains a specialized archive of these pre-heresy records, using them to identify consistent patterns in Night Lords' activities that have persisted across millennia. Inquisitor Karamazov's comprehensive analysis, psychological warfare applications in Traitor Legion tactics, dedicates an entire chapter to Sevatar's innovations. The document acknowledges his development of precision terror tactics, while carefully avoiding any language that might suggest admiration. Karamazov notes that the effectiveness of these methodologies stems not from any particular genius, but from their fundamental alignment with human psychological vulnerabilities, weaknesses the Emperor's forces have since learned to fortify through faith and discipline. This grudging recognition of Sevatar's tactical impact appears consistently in inquisitorial assessments. Unlike many traitor commanders who are dismissed as mere barbarians or dismissed as pawns of chaos, Sevatar is treated as a strategist whose methods require serious analysis. This approach reflects the practical reality that his tactical innovations continued to influence Night Lord's operations long after his disappearance, making understanding of his methods necessary for effective counter-operations. The Ordo Hereticus maintains a separate file on Sevatar focusing on his relationship with Konrad Curze. These documents explore how the first captain's pragmatic approach to terror tactics sometimes moderated the Night Haunter's more indiscriminate brutality. One analysis suggests that the absence of this moderating influence following Sevatar's capture may have contributed to the increasingly erratic and self-destructive behavior of the traitor Primarch in the heresy's later stages. This assessment serves the Inquisition's interest in understanding the command dynamics of traitor forces, particularly the influence of key subordinates on Primarch behavior. Perhaps most significant in these inquisitorial records is the attention paid to Sevatar's latent psychic abilities. While the Night Lords generally rejected psychic powers, particularly after the Council of Nicaea, Sevatar's unacknowledged talents represented a dangerous anomaly. Inquisitor Eisenhorn's treatise on unrecognized psychic threats specifically cites Sevatar as an example of how untrained abilities can manifest in combat enhancement rather than the more obvious expressions of psychic power. This analysis has informed inquisitorial protocols for identifying and neutralizing latent psychers who might otherwise escape detection by traditional methods. Beyond the Inquisition, the Adeptus Astartes maintain their own records of Sevatar, primarily focusing on his battlefield methodologies. The Blood Angels, who encountered the Night Lords during several Great Crusade operations, preserve tactical analyses of Sevatar's command style in their chapter archives on Baal. These documents, intended for officer training, examine how Sevatar maximized the impact of limited forces through precision application rather than overwhelming strength, a lesson applicable even to loyalist operations. The Dark Angels' records of Sevatar are, unsurprisingly, the most extensive among loyalist chapters. His capture during the Thrama's crusade and subsequent interrogation aboard the Invincible Reason provided the First Legion with direct insight into both his methods and personality. While most details of this interrogation remain sealed even from other Imperial organizations, certain tactical assessments derived from this encounter have been shared with inquisitorial authorities and other chapters facing Night Lords activity. One such document, Containment Protocols for Terror Tactics, draws directly from the Dark Angel's encounter with Sevatar. It outlines countermeasures to the precision targeting of command structure that characterized his operations, including distributed command protocols and misinformation strategies designed to negate the effectiveness of decapitation strikes. These protocols have been implemented by various Imperial organizations when Night Lords' activity is suspected, demonstrating the continued relevance of countering Sevatar's tactical innovations even in the 41st millennium. The Raven Guard maintain a particularly nuanced assessment of Sevatar in their chapter records. As masters of stealth and surgical strikes themselves, they recognize elements of their own doctrine in Sevatar's approach, though implemented toward very different ends. A tactical analysis by Shadow Captain Corvady notes that the effectiveness of the Night Lord's first captain stemmed from his understanding that terror is a force multiplier rather than a primary weapon, a principle that, properly redirected, aligns with our own doctrine of force application. This recognition of tactical parallels while rejecting the underlying purpose represents the careful distinction loyalist chapters make when studying traitor methodologies. The most surprising Imperial records concerning Sevatar come from the Officio Assassinorum, whose internal analyses include assessments of historical targets who successfully evaded assassination attempts. These highly classified documents examine Sevatar's apparent ability to anticipate threats before they materialized, not attributing this to his unacknowledged psychic abilities, which remained largely unknown to Imperial authorities during his lifetime, but to exceptional situational awareness and pattern recognition. These assessments have informed Assassinorum protocols for targeting individuals with similar capabilities, including specific recommendations for Culexis deployment against targets suspected of possessing unmanifested psychic potential. In contrast to these specialized and classified records, public imperial histories make little mention of Sevatar. When he appears at all, it is typically as an unnamed traitor commander, or simply as an extension of Konrad Curze, rather than as a distinct individual. This approach aligns with broader imperial policy regarding traitor Astartes, denying them the recognition that might lend their actions significance while preserving knowledge of their methods within appropriate institutional contexts. This compartmentalized approach to historical documentation creates a situation where knowledge of Sevatar varies dramatically across imperial institutions. A planetary governor might know nothing of him beyond vague references to Night Lord's atrocities, while an inquisitor specializing in Traitor Legion activity might possess detailed analyses of his tactical innovations and their evolution across millennia of Night Lord's operations. The Schola Progenium's historical curriculum mentions Sevatar only in passing, and even then without using his name directly. He appears as the architect of compliance through fear in lessons about the corruption of the Traitor Legions, his methods presented as evidence of moral failure rather than tactical innovation. This approach serves the Imperium's need to present the heresy in moral rather than strategic terms, particularly when educating future Imperial servants. More detailed information appears in the training materials of the Adeptus Arbites, particularly those sections dealing with counter-insurgency operations. Here, Sevatar's precision targeting of governmental structures is examined as a model for how relatively small forces can destabilize imperial authority on contested worlds. These materials focus on developing countermeasures rather than historical context, treating Sevatar's methods as a persistent threat template rather than the innovations of a specific individual. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains yet another perspective on Sevatar in their historical archives. Their interest focuses primarily on his modifications to Atramentor equipment, particularly the sound-dampening technologies applied to Terminator armor that allowed for stealth operations previously thought impossible in such heavy wargear. These technical analyses appear in Mechanicus databases with minimal biographical context, treating Sevatar as the originator of technical innovations rather than as a historical figure with broader significance. This fragmented approach to historical documentation serves the Imperium's practical needs while maintaining ideological consistency. By compartmentalizing knowledge of Sevatar based on institutional requirements, Imperial authorities ensure that those who need to understand his methods have access to relevant information without elevating his status in broader historical narratives. The most significant evolution in Imperial records concerning Sevatar occurred in the aftermath of the 13th Black Crusade, when increased Night Lord's activity prompted reassessment of historical data to identify effective countermeasures. Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax commissioned a comprehensive analysis of Night Lord's operational patterns across 10 millennia, seeking to identify consistent methodologies that might predict future actions. This study, Persistent Tactical Lineages in Traitor Legion Operations, explicitly acknowledged Sevatar's enduring influence on Night Lord's doctrine, tracing specific operational approaches from the Great Crusade through to 41st Millennium activities. Greyfax's analysis identified 3 persistent tactical signatures that originated with Sevatar: targeted elimination of communication infrastructure prior to main engagements, psychological operations directed specifically at command personnel rather than general populations, and the use of limited but highly visible atrocities to create disproportionate terror effects. These signatures appeared consistently across Night Lord's operations regardless of warband affiliation, suggesting that Sevatar's approach had become fundamental to their operational doctrine rather than representing the influence of a specific commander. This assessment led to significant revisions in Imperial defensive protocols when Night Lord's activity was suspected. Rather than implementing general population protection measures, Imperial commanders were advised to establish redundant command structures, maintain communications through multiple independent systems, and prepare command personnel specifically for psychological warfare countermeasures. These adjustments demonstrated the practical value of historical analysis even 10 millennia after Sevatar's active period. His tactical innovations continued to require specific countermeasures rather than general defensive preparations. The Cadian 8th Regiment incorporated these revised protocols during operations against Night Lord's elements on Kasser Partox during the 13th Black Crusade. By implementing distributed command structures and deliberate misinformation about leadership locations, they successfully negated several precision strikes against command personnel that matched historical Night Lord's patterns. The after-action report explicitly credited countermeasures to established traitor methodologies for their success, an oblique reference to the tactical lineage traced back to Sevatar. Perhaps the most significant recent development in Imperial records concerning Sevatar has been the gradual acknowledgement of his latent psychic abilities and their implications for identifying similar threats. As understanding of psychic phenomena has evolved within certain Imperial institutions, historical reassessment of Sevatar's combat capabilities has led to recognition that many of his most remarkable feats likely stemmed from unacknowledged and untrained psychic potential, rather than merely exceptional transhuman abilities. This reassessment has informed screening protocols implemented by both the Inquisition and certain Astartes chapters when evaluating potential threats. Individuals demonstrating combat precognition without manifesting other psychic signatures are now flagged for special attention, with containment protocols specifically designed to neutralize such abilities. The Black Templars, despite their general rejection of psychic warfare, have incorporated these assessments into their tactical planning when facing Night Lord's forces, demonstrating the practical value of this historical analysis even to those ideologically opposed to psychic phenomena. The Imperium's approach to Sevatar in historical records thus represents a careful balance between practical necessity and ideological consistency. His tactical innovations and their enduring influence on Night Lord's operations cannot be ignored if effective countermeasures are to be developed, yet acknowledging his significant risks, granting him a stature incompatible with the Imperium's narrative of the heresy as moral corruption rather than strategic conflict. This tension has resulted in a historical record that fragments along institutional lines, each Imperial organization preserving those aspects of Sevatar's legacy relevant to their specific responsibilities while avoiding broader historical contextualization. To the Inquisition, he remains a case study in Traitor Legion command dynamics and unrecognized psychic threats. To the Adeptus Astartes, he represents a tactical innovator whose methods require specific countermeasures. To the general Imperial population, if he exists at all in historical awareness, he is merely an unnamed extension of Konrad Curze's brutality. As the Imperium continues its endless war against the forces that would destroy it, this pragmatic approach to historical documentation serves immediate defensive needs while maintaining ideological purity. The full truth of Jago Sevatarion, his complex relationship with his Primarch, his philosophical differences with Legion doctrine, his unrecognized psychic nature, remain scattered across classified archives and specialized tactical analyses, never to be assembled into a complete picture accessible to any single Imperial institution. In this fragmentation lies perhaps the most fitting legacy for the Prince of Crows within Imperial records. Just as he employed precision targeting and psychological impact rather than brute force, his historical influence operates through specific tactical lineages rather than broad recognition. The Night Lord's Legion he helped shape may continue its operations from the shadows of the galaxy, but the methodologies Sevatar developed continue to shape Imperial defensive doctrine, an ironic legacy for a warrior who fought to tear down the Imperium he once served.